Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Overcoming Barriers to Solar plus Storage in Critical Facilities Serving Low-Income Communities. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group as part of our Resilient Power Project. We have a number of excellent speakers on the line today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled, and you can also click on that to expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit questions and comments. You can do that by typing those into the questions box on your webinar console and hitting send. We'll save about 15 minutes or so at the end of our webinar for Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We do have a lot of people registered today, so I expect there will be a lot of questions. In order to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end to type in your question. But we will be reading through the questions throughout the whole webinar, so type those in. And a final note, we are recording the webinar. We'll be sending you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the webinar slides. And we'll probably get that out to you this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest. And we'll also put those on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar. That will be Seth Mullendore. Seth is a Vice President and Project Director here at Clean Energy Group, and he's going to get us started.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This is going to be a great presentation. So just a little bit of background about who we are at Clean Energy Group. We are a nonprofit organization funded primarily by private foundations, almost exclusively, and you can see our generous supporters here. We also have a sister organization, Clean Energy States Alliance, and that is a membership organization of agencies, state agencies mostly, that manage clean energy funds across the country. Clean Energy Group, one of our main projects is our Resilient Power Project, and that project was developed about 8 years ago in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, really with the goal of enabling greater access to resilient power technologies, which for us means primarily solar paired with energy storage. The goal of the work is a reflection of the fact that low-income communities, communities of color, and other underserved communities are hit first and worst by such widespread power outages, and often lack the resources to respond and recover from those sort of emergency situations. So, Resilient Power Project, it's been around for a little over 8 years now, and we do a number of different things. We do a lot of information sharing, putting out original analysis and reports like the one we're going to cover today, and there's a few covers of other recent reports down below. We also work with policymakers to try to advance policies that enable greater, more equitable access to solar and energy storage technologies for underserved communities. And we do a lot of information sharing like this webinar. And we also work on trying to help facilitate actual project development. You can see all these resources and more at resilient-power.com or .org, sorry. This map shows some of the projects that we have supported over the life of the project through both direct technical assistance that we've provided in-house, as well as a small grant program we have that's able to award small pre-development technical assistance grants to engage engineering support to go a step further for resilient power projects. And you see a few projects highlighted here that have been built through that program or in the process. We worked with over 250 projects across the country, a lot in the Northeast where the project started, but that's expanded to all over the country, to half the states at this point. So with that, I would like to take a moment to introduce our speakers for today. So first up today, we are going to have from Clean Energy Group and Clean Energy States Alliance, Abbe Ramanan. She's a project manager with Clean Energy Group. And prior to joining us, she worked with the Access and Equity team at Vote Solar, where she helped to develop solar workforce development initiatives for low resource communities. She was also a membership and policy assistant for the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, working on climate readiness programming, and a project specialist with Dexis Consulting Group, a U.S. agency for international development contractor. Abbe received her master's degree from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where she wrote her master's thesis on state models for improving access to solar energy for low and moderate income communities. And she holds a bachelor's from international studies from American University. Next, we have with us Nicole Lim, who is the executive director of the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center. Nicole earned advanced degrees from the University of California at Berkeley and University of San Francisco School of Law. She is Pomo and has worked for the National Indian Justice Center and the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center since 1996. As executive director of the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, she works to develop exhibits, educational programs, and curricular resources that represent Native American perspectives. She founded the Tribal Youth Ambassadors Program in 2010. The program received the National Arts and Humanities Youth Program Award from the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities in 2016. She also co-edited On the Ground, California, the first in a series of books that focuses on best practices for K-12 educators of Native students. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Abbe to start the presentation, and we'll again encourage folks to enter questions as you think about them, and we'll get to them at the end. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Seth, and thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar. Just to do a bit of table setting, this webinar is based on a report produced by myself and my colleague Marielle Mango for Clean Energy Group, and it's based on work that was originally funded by a U.S. Department of Energy grant that's managed by our sister organization, the Clean Energy States Alliance. The impetus for this report was brought on by a lot of work that CEG has done with critical service providers serving disadvantaged communities to implement solar and storage for the past several years. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir about how solar and storage can improve economic and resiliency outcomes for low income and disadvantaged communities, but despite those proven benefits, we just weren't seeing a lot of penetration of solar and storage into this market. So to get into some of those reasons behind this lack of implementation we were seeing, we surveyed a group of 60 critical low-income service providers representing community service organizations, affordable housing developers, municipalities, emergency service providers, and other groups who operate in under-resourced and low-wealth areas, asking about what barriers they encountered to implementing solar and storage projects. And that was the impetus behind the creation of the report that we're discussing today. So to give you a sense of just who some of these respondents were, the majority were from the affordable housing sector. Many of you might remember that Clean Energy Group released a standalone report looking at barriers and opportunities in solar and storage implementation that was specifically in the affordable housing sector a few months ago, and that's also available on our website. Beyond affordable housing developers, our second largest group of respondents were from the community services sector. And that's a very broad term, but that includes things like resilience hubs, community centers, and also folks like the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, who we'll hear from later on. Because these two groups, affordable housing and community services, were the two largest that we heard from. And in our day-to-day work, often the two that we deal with the most and who are often the ones trying to implement solar and storage for kind of resiliency and bringing benefits to low-income communities. Those were the two that we really wanted to focus in on in this report and really get into the differences and similarities we were seeing and they were seeing in some of the barriers that they were encountering. So just to kind of give you an overview of the geography as well of the respondents we were seeing, The majority were from California and Massachusetts, which, if you know the regulatory space at all in those areas, makes total sense. There are fairly strong incentives for solar and storage implementation in those states through things like the Connected Solutions Program in Massachusetts and also the Self-Generation Incentive Program in California. But there's actually overall really good geographic diversity, and I think that's really important to note because regulatory incentives are obviously very important to the feasibility of a project when you're looking at the economics, but they're not the only factor by any means. I think the fact that Puerto Rico, for example, had 6 projects among the respondents who responded to the survey, which is actually the 3rd highest out of all of the states that responded. That's actually just a great indicator that there's often other factors at play in what makes a solar and storage project feasible and valuable to a community. So the first kind of key difference that we noted between affordable housing developers and community service providers really got at the project motivations of why they're pursuing solar and storage. So these charts might be a little confusing if you look at them at first, but what they're essentially saying is we asked respondents to rank each of the 5 choices that you see on the screen from 5, which was the most important, to 1, which is least important. And as you'll see, affordable housing providers ranked electric bill cost savings as their #1 concern, followed by energy resilience, whereas community service providers ranked resilience and then producing clean renewable electricity as their top concerns, and then followed by a much smaller percentage who ranked electric bill cost savings as their top choice, or their top motivation for pursuing solar and storage. So this is another chart which just kind of isolates that difference in rankings. There's a number of reasons why affordable housing providers might rank resilience as lower than bill cost savings. And a lot of it does just come down to a difference in sort of mission scopes. Most affordable housing developers are trying to make the economics of a solar and storage project work while managing often a portfolio of properties, many of which are operating on fairly thin margins to begin with. Whereas a community service provider, often they're a nonprofit with just different kind of financial priorities. But, while the bill cost savings are going to be important in that sort of scenario, the motivations between bill cost savings and resilience are definitely intertwined. Most of the folks we spoke to from all sectors valued resilience, but what resilience actually meant to them and how they could get those benefits to either, the affordable housing residents they were serving or their community members usually varied. As an affordable housing developer, you might be able to have a bigger impact if you can develop a strong economic case for solar and storage on your property, especially if there's a way to pass those savings down to residents, which we have seen in a few specific regulatory environments, such as DC, for example. Similarly, while many community service providers, again, are maybe nonprofits with different financial concerns and a different calculus that they're working with, the savings and economic feasibility of a project are still obviously very important and are going to make a big difference in how feasible implementation actually is. And also, it can make a big difference in the scale of impact that the project can have. So for example, if you can afford to get a larger system, maybe you can support a larger load, and that often translates to, let's say you can support a fridge for medications or food during an outage, or you can support a window unit AC so you can act as a cooling center during a heat wave. So the motivations of bill savings and also resiliency are not quite as black and white as they might seem at first. So now to just get into barriers, which was the primary focus of this report and the survey that we sent out. Across all sectors, including affordable housing, community service providers, municipalities, emergency service providers, lack of information about battery storage was the #1 most encountered barrier. And that kind of plays out in a few ways. The first is that obviously solar and storage is a burgeoning industry and folks might just not know about how it can be incorporated into their projects, or about the potential benefits it can provide once it's installed. But this also, it kind of stems from a lack of knowledge sharing. You know, many of the folks in critical service positions are already stretched super thin, and they just don't have the capacity to become sudden experts in a new technology. So, you know, especially when they're in the middle of the process of implementing solar and storage, they're making decisions without necessarily the access to expert advice that can make that process a little smoother and easier. So it's here that things like having access to a technical assistance fund, or even access to free webinars or other sort of capacity building offerings can make a big difference in how smooth and successful the project development process actually can be. And that also gets into the second most encountered barrier, which was technical issues, which is obviously a very broad term and can mean a lot of different things. But again, it comes down to, you know, who you have on your side when you're going through this process of trying to make solar and storage work on a particular site. You know, technical issues can mean everything from having issues with where you can actually place the solar on the roof, or, you know, how you deal with having HVAC systems up on the roof and how those can interact with solar panels, how you can isolate a load specifically in a building so that it can be supported by a battery system during an outage. And all of those are difficult to deal with if you don't have prior experience with solar and storage, and it's just so helpful having kind of an expert on your side that can help with a lot of that. So again, getting back to the key differences between affordable housing and community services when it came to barriers that they were encountering, I want to just highlight a few of the key differences that we really noticed. One was fire safety. As you'll see on your screen, there was a huge gap in the number of affordable housing developers who experienced or expected to experience some issues with fire safety in the process of developing a solar and storage project versus community organizations. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that, you know, for a lot of affordable housing developments, they're often home to hundreds of people. So there's going to be more fire safety codes to contend with. And, you know, again, a lot of those affordable housing developers might have more experience developing a solar and storage project as well. So they may just be expecting to encounter those obstacles because they've encountered them in the past. And that just gets into kind of the schematics of how the survey was implemented. But also, so with the fire safety, anecdotally, CEG has seen that fire safety can be a huge issue with project implementation as well. You know, if there's an issue with where the battery can be located, how far the roof is allowed to extend in terms of dealing with where fire trucks can park, you know, what loads are allowed to be backed up by battery storage in the event of a fire emergency. Those are all issues that can make or break a project and make or break having battery storage on a site. And those are just often more encountered with larger projects, which are more likely to be done by affordable housing developers. Similarly, affordable housing developers really experienced a lot more permitting and interconnection delays, which again, that could be for a variety of reasons, but one in particular is that those projects are often bigger, and that means they're much more likely to trigger an interconnection study. And so again, while battery storage in particular is still relatively new, so a lot of the campaigns to streamline permitting and interconnection that have been done for solar, for example, by DOE, and NREL in particular, that hasn't really bled into battery storage. So it's still just kind of a crapshoot, depending on if the utility is familiar with battery storage, you know, if they're going to make that process easier for the site or not. It can be quite difficult at times. And then finally, I did want to flag regulatory uncertainty as a barrier that both affordable housing developers and community service providers experienced. As you can see there, it was about 50-50 of whether or not they expected to encounter that particular barrier in their project. And this it goes beyond just if there are existing state incentives, which can obviously really improve the economics of a project. But as Nicole will get into, even in a state like California, where there are great programs like SCHIP, if that, for example, SCHIP is oversubscribed, it can make the process that much harder where, you know, a site has to decide like, all right, do we wait and see if we can eventually get access to the incentive, or do we try and go after something else? And it can just make the decision making for a facility of which path to pursue that much more complicated. And it is, again, where technical assistance can definitely come in handy. So that was just a very brief overview of a lot of the primary barriers and highlights of key differences that we saw in the report. And if you want to dig deeper into that, I highly recommend you just look at the full report. But I did also want to get into some of the policy recommendations that we highlighted in the report as well. So to overview, as I mentioned a few times, technical assistance support can be just so helpful for any project, both, you know, for large affordable housing developers as well as smaller community organizations. So grant programs that can cover that initial kind of like a feasibility assessment or that initial sort of technical assistance in getting a project off the ground, figuring out the specifics of, you know, how to engineer it. All of that can be super helpful, and having funds like CEG's own technical assistance fund, or I know the South Face Institute also has a similar fund that cover the costs of an initial feasibility assessment, can be really helpful towards improving the success of those projects, particularly because then the community service provider, the affordable housing developer, whoever the client is, they then have access to that sort of expertise where they're not suddenly having to make decisions based on their own kind of whatever knowledge they might happen to have, but they can actually freely access the knowledge of someone who's experienced in the process. Similarly, you know, sharing free knowledge and capacity building products like webinars, like case studies, are so important for just improving awareness of battery storage and reducing the knowledge burden on critical service facilities. And that also gets into offering capacity building opportunities. So for some of these facilities, you know, maybe they don't initially have that experience in solar and storage, but maybe they want to get into it after their first foray into project development, and having those sorts of capacity building opportunities. Clean Energy Group, for example, through one of our funders, offers capacity building grants for folks who want to invest in one particular staff person to really learn more about the ins and outs of solar and storage, can just improve the outcomes for that facility in years to come, and create opportunities for them to share that knowledge with other folks within their community. And finally, getting into more of the financial opportunities, developing innovative incentive and finance options that can work for a variety of providers is also super important. You know, particularly developing financing opportunities that are targeted at LMI populations can be great at getting at a sector that is often really underlooked. So things like the Maryland Resiliency Hub program are great examples of programs that are structured to help foster more projects in those areas specifically. And incentive programs, again, like Connected Solutions in the Northeast, can also help monetize grid services that batteries provide and just improve project economics overall. And then finally, establishing a monetary value for resilience is going to go a long way towards improving all project economics across the board. You know, as we saw earlier, most critical service providers do care about providing resilience, but they have to make the economics work to be able to do that. So this obviously isn't an option that's available for everyone, but having the ability to, you know, use metrics like avoided cost of outages can just improve project outcomes across all types of facilities, because they're able to not just look at it as an expenditure that's going out on, you know, spending money on a battery system, spending money on operation and maintenance costs, but also that added value of resilience of avoiding outages during a blackout period, being able to provide critical community services like acting as a cooling center, like providing refrigeration services for medications and things like that, are also so important, and it's much harder to value them if there isn't a way to establish that monetary value for resilience, and that can make a huge difference in project economics. So now that I've given you all a very brief overview of the report, I wanted to hand things over to Nicole Lim of the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center to talk about their experience developing a solar and storage project as a community service provider. CIMCC received a technical assistance grant from CEG last year to cover a feasibility assessment for adding solar and storage to the site as part of the broader Resilient Native Generations program, which seeks to expand tribal stewardship and ensure that Native voices and perspectives are represented in city and county climate change planning and adaptions. And they can speak with a lot more experience about the actual process for a community service provider and experiencing these barriers and opportunities. So I'll turn it over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Abby. Good afternoon, everyone. So with our Resilient Native Generations project, we kind of embarked down this journey about 2 years ago. We completed a lot of planning and are now in an implementation phase. And just to give you some background, just to give you some background on the museum, we're located in Santa Rosa, which is about an hour north of San Francisco. We do consider ourselves a statewide institution. There's over 200 tribes throughout the state of California, about 109 federally recognized tribes, and about 80 unfederally recognized tribes throughout the state. And our goal is really to educate the public about the history and culture and contemporary lives of California Indians from a Native perspective. And the Native perspective is really key because, you know, the legacy of genocide, which for a long time through the mission system and the gold rush really focused on our physical extermination. Since then, federal and state policies have really facilitated a lot of cultural erasure, erasing our foodways, erasing our, you know, our heritage and our cultural arts, and really focusing on trying to assimilate Native people into mainstream society. Obviously, we want to preserve our heritage and revitalize our traditions. That photo there is a photo of my great-grandmother, Elizabeth Kosh, from the Big Valley Indian Reservation in Clear Lake, California. And I always have her photo there because it reminds me about our oral history and the importance of telling our story. And her mother was a childhood survivor of the Bloody Island massacre that happened on the shores of Clear Lake in the 1850s. And during that time in the gold rush, there were over 300 massacres throughout California. And with the Bloody Island massacre, we're not certain how many people perished during that time. They estimate that in the mass grave there's anywhere from 10 to 800 people. And many of the children were able to survive those massacres by hiding in the water and breathing through the tule reeds. So we're upcoming on the anniversary of that massacre on May 15th, and we still go and have celebrations and pay our respects to our people. And, you know, it's about our resilience and our survival, and being able to tell our story is a really critical part of that. Our museum really focuses on community and culture and connectivity and bringing our people together. We demonstrate a culturally sustaining pedagogy, and that's really focusing on that idea of culture, combating cultural erasure. Our cultures are not static. They're being lived by the young people who are part of them, and they're going to be changed by those young people. Those young people are going to redefine our culture in the future. So we're very much youth-centered. We're very much about giving our youth cultural learning opportunities with elders and other members of our community, and making sure that they have the tools and capacities to carry our culture and history forward. While museums have beautiful collections, and many museums throughout California have our beautiful pomo baskets and other items, we remind ourselves that our museum is not about objects, it's about people. And it's our people that breathe life into those objects, that give those objects meaning, and will continue to do that in the future. So there's many reasons we need resiliency, but we're resilient, and we have been ever since Spanish arrived on our shores. But one of the issues that we've had in recent years is obviously wildfires. Everyone's heard about the wildfires that have consistently happened over the years in California. We've had our geographic service areas, 3 counties. We have 24 tribes, Pomo tribes in those 3 counties. These 2 fires in 2017, the Tubbs fire, the Nuns fire, and then 2020, the Lightning Complex fire, happened specifically to Santa Rosa area. So our museum with the Tubbs fire was very close to the burn zone, and we weren't able to access the building for several days and didn't even know if it was still standing. And through that, we really kind of just naturally emerged as a resiliency center because people came and filled our parking lot and were just trying to see if their homes were still there. And so we started, coming into the museum as soon as we could access it and providing services and giving out water and food and anything that we could do to support folks who were on site. And then since then, there's been multiple issues. There's always fires that are impacting some of our tribal communities in our area. We've had, weeks of really hazardous air quality, depending on where the fires are burning and which way the wind is blowing. And then we have the PG&E proactive power safety shutoffs that have been happening. And those can last up to a week's time, where many people in our community, don't have power, their food goes bad, they can't power up medical devices. It really has a disproportionate impact on our tribal communities, especially our elders. And it's very sad to see the conditions that happened during that time. So we really wanted to focus on how we can create a resiliency center, do more direct services, and make sure that there's more equitable distribution of aid during a crisis. And one of the issues with fires is that our cultural educators don't necessarily think fire is a bad thing. Not the way that the wildfires happen, but since time immemorial, our people have always done controlled burns as a way of stewarding our ancestral territory. And that is a way to bring in resilience and regrowth, to nurture the plants, and to provide nutrients to the soil. And, for 100 years in California, there was a ban on controlled burning, which many of our native and indigenous fire ecology people say, is the reason that we have such disastrous wildfires these days. So if you see this photo of the tree, and we really, acorns and oak trees are a keystone species and a really important traditional food source for us. And I like how the tree is reflecting in the water, because it reminds me that, our oak trees, what is growing on the outside, what we see above ground is mirrored in the roots underground. And it really speaks to the strengths of our people and the need for our people to have participation and authority and a seat at the decision-making table when it comes to the environmental stewardship of our own land. And so we built the resilient native generations on that idea of wanting to reach out to our community and really get input, but also build up their capacity to participate, across the aisle when it comes to how we care for our homeland. And so we did a resilience tribal community survey and started working with our community to identify priorities And also, you can see in that last slide, we also collected stories and photos and started creating maps to help publish those stories of Native perspectives on climate change. And our community really focused on what were the issues that they felt were the most priority impacting them. Emergency response and transportation during evacuations was really critical. We often see during wildfires, you know, people who have financial resources just kind of go get a hotel in a place outside the burn and the smoke zone, and people who don't have financial resources are stuck. And so it's not a time that everyone can just take a vacation. So there's no equitable distribution of aid when it comes to those periods. Our health impacts, knowing the disproportionate health issues in our community, definitely lung health issues, heart health issues, and the need for medical devices. Cultural impacts, the loss of our traditional foods, our gathering areas, the ability to steward cultural resources. You know, we're trying to revitalize our basketry traditions. And many times, if you read the history of California, you know, I think explorers and settlers often wrote about it being a so-called untamed wilderness, and it wasn't. It was a beautifully cared for garden. Pomo people are known for weaving the most beautiful baskets in the world. Plants don't just produce beautiful basket materials if they're not cared for. Pomo people stewarded them, they prayed to them, they showed gratitude, they cared for their cultural plants and medicines year round. And because of the privatization of land or the restrictions on access in public lands, we don't have that opportunity to continue that. And so we need to increase those opportunities. Environmental issues, wildfires, rise in sea temperatures, again, both of those things impacting our ability to gather and process cultural resources. Home displacement, affordable housing, economic losses from power outages, and then also because we're very much heavily within an agricultural area and what people consider a wine country, there was a huge concern about pesticides and chemicals as a result of the wine industry and its impact on our foods and resources. So, and then I think that, you know, the other thing that really emerged from the survey is our community's concern for future generations. And recently I was at a meeting where another travel program from the Pine Ridge Reservation was presenting on their resiliency hub and clean energy projects. And they mentioned how one way to combat colonization is ensuring that other people aren't making the decisions or deciding the future of your children. And that really resonated with me and really speaks to, you know, this tribal member who stated that, you know, she was really concerned about fossil fuel consumption and its impact on the reservation. However, she felt that the youth had greater respect for the reservation and were learning and understanding and taking a leadership role, and with their persistence that they may be able to guarantee the future of their children and great-grandchildren. And that's something really critical, that we're focused on instilling those values and those capacities in our youth, because we think about, you know, the future of our children and grandchildren in 7 generations. So one aspect of that is creating a healing hub, or I've seen other communities describe it as a wellness hub. But it's really critical that that our approach is from a strength-based strategy. And that's because as Native people, we carry historical trauma. This image of historical trauma is a Pomo woman with a burden basket. Typically, burden baskets are used for collecting, harvesting acorns and other things. And you see in her burden basket, she carries her trauma in there. And you can see throughout our history, all of the potential impacts and fallouts of that trauma that create quite a bit of anxiety and depression and negative coping mechanisms within our community. And there's nothing like a fire or a pandemic to trigger those things. And so one thing that's been really critical for us is integrating cultural programming into our approach so that we bring our community together. And honestly, right now, a lot of that's being done virtually. But it provides us an opportunity to process that trauma and anxiety, and in the case of the pandemic, grief, and come together as a community and learn these, cultural skills that really strengthen our ability to withstand a lot of these challenges that we're experiencing. And also built within that is our resilient power system, and really looking at our facility and the infrastructure within our facility to be able to continue to stay open and be able to provide those direct services and those programmatic services to our community. And so we have 26,000 square foot facility. We're planning a rooftop solar array, backup battery storage for about 72 hours of operation, clean air filtration and cooling, also integrating in within our 5,000 square foot warehouse, a traditional food incubator where our community can come together to store, process, market, provide vendors for our native foods. That was something really evident in the survey, that our community felt resilience and independence was getting back to our traditional foods. And one of our tribal community members, Mia Marufo, she always says, kill the food, kill the culture. And so we really see that getting back to our traditional foods is not only a way of restoring health to ourselves, but also health to our environment. Through that, we'll reduce our energy costs about $21,000 a year, set off 68 metric tons of carbon, and be able to provide services when we have those power safety shutoffs, wildfires, or when we can't go outside because the air is just too bad. And all of these things, really serve that our traditional ecological knowledge and sustaining our values for stewardship, preparing our youth to carry on those responsibilities in the future. And many of the challenges and issues that Abbe mentioned in the report, we've really experienced. I feel like many times we have to be able to have a crystal ball and see into the future, because a lot of the decisions that we're trying to make are really, focused on predicting where we're going to be 2 or 3 years from now. And so when we were pursuing our prepaid power purchase agreement, for us, we were really focused on wanting to own the system outright as soon as possible. And so we pursued a structure that facilitated that, but we did have to retain technical service providers. We're working with American Microgrid Solutions because, we also are doing an HVAC renovation and then installing solar shortly thereafter. So there's a lot of things that are outside the realm of our expertise, and we've really had to work with our TA providers to get the information that we need to make the informed decisions that will be best for our organization. For the battery backup system, we've chosen to add that on later. We're really looking at trying to find funding to purchase it outright. With the SCHIP, you can only apply to one of the 2 programs. The first program, which is the Equity Resilience Program, again, is oversubscribed, and there's really no prediction on when it's going to be funded and how long that's going to take and how much funding is going to be available. So it's kind of a gamble to wait on that. However, it would reimburse the battery 100%. The other option is the commercial facilities program, and there, is more potential there. However, you're really only looking at about 40% in reimbursement. So, when you're coming from a nonprofit and you're trying to stretch resources as far as they can go so that they can you can have more available to your community. You're always wanting to go for that 100% versus that 40%, but knowing when and how that's going to happen down the road is a little bit of a gamble. So being able to work in a phased approach has been good for us. We were able to work with our board of supervisors and getting a resiliency designation. And so that definitely helps our ability to compete within the resilience program when it does open. So we're waiting to see. And in terms of lessons learned, we're really focused on making sure that our tribal communities have equitable distribution of resources. And in doing that, we really do have to work with a lot of non-tribal communities to raise up the issues and our voices so that they're aware of those concerns. And a lot of that takes, creating more visibility and more representation in places where Native people aren't always represented. And sometimes that takes a lot of education. We typically come into contact with people who are allies. However, sometimes we do feel tokenized, especially when it comes to environmental issues. There's a lot of effort on folks who want to learn about our culture, but don't necessarily want to give us a seat at the decision-making table. And so we're continually always trying to combat appropriation and stereotypes, and also that kind of usurpation of our authority and control. And that's really critical when it comes to our land and our cultural resources. We're making sure that we stay community-led, and we know that our community wants to focus on our environmental stewardship and food sovereignty, so those remain our priorities. And then we also want to make sure that while we're increasing our own institutional infrastructure, that we're working within our community to increase their capacities as well. And that is, creating curriculum and working with Clean Energy Group and doing webinars and getting more information out to our Native community members so that they can make their own decisions and infrastructure improvements within their homes and their communities. So with that, I will turn it back, but that is my contact information, and feel free to reach out to us at the museum at any time. We're always happy to help provide ideas and resources and experiences anytime they're useful. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Nicole, for that insight on your work in developing the Resilience Hub, and Abbe for the overview of the report. So we have a lot of questions, a lot of really great questions. I'm going to jump around a little bit, and we likely will not have time to get to them all. So apologies for questions that we do not get to, but please do feel free to reach out to us and Nicole for any questions that you still have at the end. So this is a question related to answers on the report, Abbe, about whether you anticipate that the lack of information about storage or technical issues might obscure the magnitude of interconnection and finance barriers, simply because the projects maybe didn't get far enough along in the process to encounter those kind of later stage barriers.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. I think for a lot of folks, the way that we structured the responses to the survey, folks could either state if they were expecting to encounter a barrier or had already experienced it. And for the lack of awareness, a lot of folks had already experienced it, and that a lot of that gets into, our sample size was a bit self-selecting because a lot of the folks that we reached out to had in fact gotten a technical assistance grant from Clean Energy Group, and that's how we were in touch with them. But for most of them, a lot of times they hadn't even fully heard of battery storage until they heard of Clean Energy Group or attend one of our webinars or something like that, and kind of made the connection like, oh, this is something I could consider for my project. But that doesn't really even touch on the sort of lost opportunities of folks who just never even consider pursuing battery storage in their project or pursuing solar and storage for their facility. And that was obviously a little harder to capture with the particular survey that we implemented, but that is something that, you know, we'd definitely like to dig into more in the future, and how to expand our reach.
Great. And the next question I think is to you, Nicole. This was an interesting note. It says, does the imbalance between cash flow as seen by housers and community-based organizations that we found in the report also point to equity issues with respect to how community-based services agencies access and think about revenue and wealth, and how other actors may limit their role? In other words, is the issue that community organizations are underserved, or that we limit our view of community-based organizations and don't see them as groups that should have a hand in developing and benefiting from revenue-generating projects like solar? Curious to get your insights on that, Nicole.
So many issues come up for me with that. We've actually been struggling with our tax assessor in Sonoma County, and many museums throughout the state have had issues where the museums fall under a welfare exemption, and many tax assessors, if they see any for-profit activity happening on the grounds of a museum, will want to tax that space. And so it's really been discouraging nonprofits and museums from trying to generate revenue. And that's been a huge issue with the pandemic, because we've been closed for a year. And so we haven't been able to generate normally, you know, things with visitors or from our stores or things like that. So so I do see that as an issue. I think that that museums and nonprofits in general are kind of discounted in these conversations. And I know that with us, because we've tried to do a lot of direct services to our community, we've actually brought in more grant funds, but many of them were passed through as, you know, as cash support in different ways that through our assessments, we were able to serve our community during the pandemic. However, that has disqualified us from taking advantage of, you know, certain government support programs, because it looks like our income increased during the pandemic, versus it wasn't really our operating income. It was how we were able to deliver services to our own community. So a lot of complicated issues going on when it comes to that subject.
Great, thanks for that, Nicole. And this one was a comment that came in, but I think it's important to note that it just that the utility's familiarity with energy storage does not necessarily demonstrate a linear relationship with ease of interconnection and approval. So just because a utility does know more about storage doesn't necessarily translate into an easier interconnection process and approval by the utility. So that is an important point, and so thanks for that. Another question came in about the technical support that's offered, and asking how quickly and efficiently an assessment can be completed to the level of effectiveness that would help decision makers be able to make an informed decision about pursuing battery storage and a resilience project. I can speak to just generally Clean Energy Group's experience with the technical service providers we work with. It could be done, you know, depending on how much information is there. If you have all the information together, it can be done as little as a couple of months. But for the most part, projects take a longer time frame than that for a variety of reasons. And Nicole, maybe you can say a little bit just about the process that you've had and the time that you've worked on the assessment for California Indian Museum and Cultural Center?
Sure. I think it took a couple of months. It was a lot of meeting and going over, our existing plans, but also our plans for growing in the future. And, I wouldn't say it was a painless process, but it went pretty smoothly. And our TA providers are really experienced and just worked really closely with us. And it's just a very detailed, thorough process. So I think as long as you're working closely and regular communication, it's something that can be got through pretty quickly.
Great. Question, this folks worked with NRECA to model and plan microgrids for our member electric co-ops. One of the hardest challenges is quantifying the monetary value of adding resilience to their grids with battery storage. How is Clean Energy Group helping their project partners at community centers and affordable housing developments to establish monetary metrics around resilience? Is there research available on this? I'll say that from our experience, this is a very tough area and something that comes up a lot. How do you put a dollar amount on resilience? We have worked with a couple of projects that have found methodologies to do this, whether it was through lost revenues or lost work hours or loss of services that they could provide. There are some fairly generic ways to do this. There's some of the national labs developed what's called the interruption cost estimator that puts a value very generically on the hours per hour cost of power outages for facilities in different regions. But I'll say that it's very difficult, and we haven't found a good methodology that we would necessarily say fits all circumstances. Again, Nicole, I don't know if that's something that you guys have looked at for your project.
Yeah, we haven't. I mean, we've really just been focused on the necessity of the battery because of the fires and the power outages. So it's not something I think that we have to quantify in terms of financial as much as it is just emergency.
Yeah. Another question just about your process through the museum. Are you able to promote or facilitate efforts to build local technical and installation experience or workforce development and employment opportunities around the technologies?
We haven't explored that yet. We're working with local providers, and then also as part of our resiliency project, we're reaching out to different environmental programs like the California Conservancy folks that go out and steward the lands, and being able to work with them to provide native educators so that they have more knowledge about our native plants and stewardship practices when they're out there doing clearing and things like that. So we're trying to build partnerships when it comes to stewardship, and haven't really yet pursued the other technical partnerships.
Great, thank you. So I see that we're almost out of time here. So I know we didn't get to a number of the questions, but I appreciate everybody's input on this. I want to be respectful of time. So with that, I'd like to thank Nicole and Abbe for the great presentations and for your time today, and turn things back over to Sam for some closing thoughts. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Seth, and thanks, Abbe and Nicole, for being here today. Before everyone leaves today, I just want to let you know about a couple of webinars that we have coming up. Those should be listed on your screen now. May is a busy month for us. We may even have one more webinar in the works. So take a look at the list on your screen. Lots of really interesting webinars coming up. The one coming up next week is on solar for manufactured homes. Those are also known as, formerly known as mobile homes. And then we have a lot more later in the month. I'll let you read about those. You can read more and register at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So we hope to see you there. Thanks again for attending today, and have a great day, everyone.